Level up your LA Kings experience with the new Vivid Seats Elite Seats. All the on-ice Kings action with even more exclusive access. Enjoy great seats to the game along with premier dining inside the Lexus Club with all-you-can-eat food and non-alcoholic beverages. Plus, get a free Team LA Kings item and parking with your purchase. Score your Vivid Seats Elite Seats tickets today and earn rewards on each purchase from the only ticket company that rewards you for buying. Experience it live with Vivid Seats, the official partner of the LA Kings.
You're listening to an LA Kings podcast. For more episodes of this and every other Kings program, visit lakings.com/podcast.
You're listening to All the Kings Men, the official podcast of the LA Kings. Now, here's your host, Jesse Cohen.
We are revisiting the top 10 questions of the 2024 LA Kings offseason. Joining me again, Zach Dooley. How are you doing today, Zach?
Jesse, I am doing well. How about you?
I'm okay. We're going to go out
Just
of order.
Okay, huh?
We're going to dive straight into it.
Okay.
Because you and I have been watching soccer for an hour before we started recording.
I'm a Netherlands fan.
Sorry, football. We've been watching football.
Depends on who you're asking, right?
Yeah.
Tough go for the Netherlands.
So we're going to dive in. We're going to go out of order because I want to get the first one out of the way because this is like the one thing. For those of you unfamiliar with the format, we lay out what the top 10 questions will be for the offseason with the understanding that the questions will be answered as the offseason progresses. We got a lot more answers a lot earlier than I thought we would. But going out of order, we're going to start with number 3 because this is the one that I assumed would be resolved first. I was wrong. I was loud wrong. The question is, what will Quinton Byfield's contract look like? My assumption, and I think a lot of people's assumption, was that they would address this first in order to know what the rest of their contract structures would look like. This is winding up being one of the final issues that they've addressed. So Quinton Byfield still does not have a contract extension. He was offered a qualifying offer. That was a formality. So we can move past that one because we don't know yet.
I think that when the Kings labeled it their top priority, which they did, I think the association naturally became, well, it'll get done first.
Right.
I don't think that's just really the case with restricted free agents. Like, look around the NHL. Jeremy Swayman is unsigned. Moritz Seider, Seth Jarvis, Lucas Raymond. Like, these are the high-end RFAs. Guys like Byfield, he's in that category. Those deals also haven't been signed. Thomas Harley in Dallas. Like, these are higher-level RFAs that still haven't been signed. Just because it wasn't done first, it's still the number one priority of the offseason, right? This is the best player who the Kings will have to sign. No questions about that. The most important player for the future the Kings have to sign. No question about that. It's a deal that will not only shape this year, but the following several years. If he signs a 3-year deal, it still shapes the 4th, 5th, and 6th years because he has to have a new deal. If he signs an 8-year deal, it shapes those years in a more defined way. So most important move left for the Kings. It'll get done. We saw Mikey Anderson, Sean Durzi 2 years ago sign in September. It's July. Not a concern for me. And it'll get done in due time.
Yeah, and I think that bringing up Mikey Anderson and Sean Durzi is instructive because I certainly know from a fan's perspective it feels better to have everything settled. But whether
for me too, like it would have been great if he signed on June 6th,
but if he signs, a week ago or September 18th, it doesn't make any tangible difference to the LA Kings 2024-25 season. Once training camp starts, maybe it gets to be collar tugging time, but then you have until October 10th, right, when they open against Buffalo. I don't think it'll get that far. So,
I personally don't either.
Yeah.
And we've got a lot of time between now and then, and we stacked a bunch of announcements, so let's maybe save one for a couple weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So moving on, back to the original question that was number 1 is, will Jim Hiller return as head coach? What will his staff look like? We know that Jim Hiller will return as head coach. His staff will consist of DJ Smith, Newell Brown,
Mike Buckley.
Thank you, and JD, whose name I always blank on, or DJ. I mean, sorry,
Derek Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, Derek Johnson. So many initials in this team.
And Samson Lee.
Yes, and Samson Lee, video coach. Newell Brown is the only new name added to that list.
The only new name on the list?
Former assistant coach for the Ducks, the Canucks, I want to say the Coyotes,
I think he's been around the block.
Yeah, he's been around. But most recently of the Anaheim Ducks, he will round out the staff. So that is the head coaching staff decided. No movement on this since we recorded, I don't think. Which prospects will get entry-level contracts, begin their professional careers? Actually, I take it back. I think Lawrence and Jamson did sign since we last recorded. And since then, we have 4 new draft picks. Liam Greentree may wind up signing an ELC. There have been a bunch of other draft picks taken in the first round that have signed their ELCs. Last year, Dvorak signed his. He was a second-round pick, not shortly after getting drafted. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Greentree and Carter George join the ranks of players with ELCs on sliding contracts back to their junior teams.
Totally agree, right? Because with those guys, they don't count against the 50 contract limit, which the Kings are always brushing up against, depending on how widely you brush. But it's like a formality, right? Like Liam Greentree, barring crazy circumstances, like will sign an ELC with the LA Kings. Doesn't mean he'll play for the LA Kings this year. And I know the question was begin their professional careers as well. That probably doesn't apply to Liam Greentree.
No.
Unless he has a staggering training camp and makes the LA Kings. But he's one of those guys who can only play in the NHL or the OHL, not the AHL.
And I want to interject, and make it perfectly clear, because I think a lot of these terms get thrown around and everything. Signing your entry-level contract has zero impact over your eligibility to play in different leagues.
Yep.
And if Liam Greentree...
You just need one to play in the NHL.
Yes. And if Liam Greentree or Carter George or both of them sign their entry-level contracts, it doesn't mean that they may get a signing bonus, but they're not earning a salary, and they will be easily returned to their OHL teams. They are not eligible to play in the AHL, even if they have signed an entry-level contract. Meanwhile, players like Jacob Dvorak, who did sign an entry-level contract last year, but because he was trained and drafted out of the Czech Republic or Czechia, he is eligible to play in both the CHL or all three, the CHL, the AHL, or the NHL.
Agreements, right? That impacts eligibility in players that never made a ton of sense to me, even though I understand why. But not a rule.
It's all transfer agreements negotiated between leagues. And Cohen Ziemer, and I confess I don't know this rule inside and out as well as I know the other ones, because he turns 20 during the season. He is eligible to play in the AHL or return to the WHL.
It's a birth year thing. So, players who turn 20 before the new year from the CHL can play in the AHL. And I only know it so well because when I worked in the AHL, had a situation, it was like Emile Poirier of the Calgary Flames, December birthday, 19-year-old, turned 20 in season, was allowed to play with us in the AHL because he had a right side of December birthday.
So Cohen Ziemer has an entry-level contract. He meets the age requirements. That does not mean that he is necessarily playing in the AHL.
Downside of that, though, you can't play in the World Juniors in your age 20.
Right.
So it's a give and take, I guess.
So lots of interesting stuff going on with prospects and reserve list players. We will go into that.
Maybe just to recap it, Dvorak, Ziemer, Booth, Lawrence, Yamson all could begin their professional careers this season with Ontario if the player and organization chooses to do so. Imagine we will certainly see
I think Lawrence and Jamson will be on Ontario because I don't think they can.
Jamson could go to Europe.
Oh, right. Sure.
Angus Booth, your boy.
Yeah.
And
Beef.
Caleb Lawrence,
Right.
Big Beef. They will be, in the professional ranks
Right.
within
They
the
will be on the
organization.
Ontario rank.
There's a decision to be made for Ziemer and Dvorak. And I'd like to think Yamson, like you said, would be here also.
Next question, skipping the Byfield one, we already talked about that. Another very simple answer. Will Victor Arvidsson and or Matt Roy return? Those were the two high-profile unrestricted free agents. The answer is simply no. Matt Roy signed with the Washington Capitals. Victor Arvidsson signed with the Edmonton Oilers. If I had a boo sound effect, I would play it here. I understand why both players chose to move on to different teams. It's disappointing. Obviously, most Kings fans were fans of both of those players, but they are no longer with the LA Kings.
Jesse will need to develop a new best playmaker on the LA Kings member, unless it'll be the honorary,
and Connor McDavid,
emeritus.
Connor McDavid will have to get used to being the second best playmaker
it's gonna be
on
tough
the
for
Edmonton
him.
Oilers.
It's going to be tough for him. Tough losses, right?
Yeah.
Kings brought in other players and are looking for internal guys to replace them. But like Matt Roy, great success story of the organization, right? How many 7th round picks do you develop through your AHL team and see go on to be that level of an impact player, glad he got paid. A guy who has earned those dollars, and it'll suck to see Victor Arvidsson on the other side of what will inevitably be part 4 of the playoffs next year.
And for the sake of the team, well, for the sake of the organization, the franchise, whatever you want to call it, I hope that is the last time that players of that value are lost to free agency with no return. I understand why that is how it played out, but I don't think you can afford to do that more than once or twice.
I think that any team trying to win in the playoffs has to do that.
Well, I mean,
or sign them, like
well, that's the
right, like
that's the issue. And to be clear, like let's look at Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay, whether it was by trade or allowing players to walk away, lost high-profile players.
Yeah,
and it happens. Mm-hmm. I just don't think you can do it 3, 4, 5 years. Like at some point, you have to. I think asset management is an over leaned upon phrase. I think people reference it without really understanding the value of assets or how assets are protected or replenished. However, you do have to recoup some value for your assets at some point. You can't. So like I said, I totally understand why the two of them, why it played out the way it did. I hope it is not a recurring theme. Who will be the goaltenders under contract at the end of the summer? We're blowing through this. We're like 10 minutes in and we're already halfway through.
Might have to dissect the Netherlands-England soccer game.
Yeah.
You just watched and all of your revelations to fill this thing out.
Who will be the goaltenders under contract at the end of the summer? So far, we have 3, Darcy Kemper, David Riddick, Phoenix Copley. I'm assuming Eric Portillo will ultimately be tendered a contract. He has been qualified, which means the Kings retain his rights. They have exclusive negotiating opportunity. That'll round it out. My hunch is when the season starts, Kemper and Riddick will be in LA, Copley and Portillo will be in Ontario. Mm-hmm. That's what training camp's for. But I mean, that I'd say we're like 95% sure that's how it's going to play out.
Yep. And likely you'll see another goaltender or 2 added, but they could be on AHL deals. Not sure who or when, but you can't go in with 4. You have to at least have a solid guy on an AHL contract who is familiar and has played in that league, who can be your 5th goalie. Doesn't have to be an NHL deal, but it wouldn't surprise me if multiple players were signed at least to AHL contracts to kind of add a little bit of back-end depth in case there is an injury. And you also have to consider, Phoenix Copley is coming off of a major knee injury, right? All signs, I think, point to a guy who will be ahead of schedule just because it's Phoenix Copley, but like, you got to have a little bit of backup, and I think the Kings will add that at some point.
And just to be thorough, last year, actually it wasn't last year, Ryan Bednard, and I'm blanking on number 68's name.
Jacob Ingham.
Thank you, Jacob Ingham. Like there have been a number of goalies play for the Ontario Reign over the last handful of seasons. Aaron Dell, right, who ultimately wound up joining the Kings, signing an NHL
as did
contract.
Jacob Ingham.
Yeah, but they spend, Jacob Ingham, for example, and Ryan Bednard spent time in Greenville. So, yeah, there will be depth added in the goalie pipeline, just as there was in the forward and defense. Like, if you're looking at the rosters, there are plenty of players, which brings us to who from the 4th line will return. This was a blend of free agents, Lizotte, Grundstrom, and Lewis. Lizotte and Grundstrom were RFAs. Lewis was an unrestricted free agent. Lewis is returning.
Yep.
Grundstrom and Lizotte were not. Lizotte was allowed to walk. Grundstrom was traded. Unclear what the 4th line will look like, but presumably for at least some games, I'm expecting at the bare minimum 26, Trevor Lewis. And I say 26 because he's 26 games away from playing 1,000 games. And I can't imagine the Kings would bring him back and then not factor that into it.
I think you're looking at 2 guys who are really penciled in there, which is Turcotte and Thomas. Mm-hmm. Young players who the Kings need to play NHL roles. Ideally, they outperform a 4th line role, but from what we've gathered, that seems to be where they'll start with some combination of a Lewis, a Fagemo, maybe one of those UFA, AHL, NHL guys the Kings added as the 3rd member of that line. Maybe the Kings play an 11-7 look, maybe a little bit more regularly with the success they had with that look last year. So I think Thomas, Turcotte, guys you can really expect to see there. with some Trevor Lewis for sure, because he's got that veteran, experience that the Kings like.
Yeah, this year of more than I think any other year, I am open to the idea of different players playing all over the lineup. Like I know what we have been told to expect. I know what a lot of people are expecting based on their own hunches. And I just, last year we knew what game one would look like. And after that, it would be a toss up.
I think we know what day one of training camp will look like. And that does not mean game one, right? Like we saw last year how quickly
100%
all of that can change. Then a Victor Arvidsson goes down and an Alex Laferriere emerges. So I think,
and Jim Hiller line rushes would not match the start of the game lineup.
If Jim Hiller was sitting here with us, he would tell us that the lines on day one of training camp very well might not be the lines on day two of training camp, right? Like he's very open that he's going to mix and match.
And last year in the playoffs, if I'm not mistaken, the third line was for at least a game or two was Fiala, Lizotte, and Lewis.
It was listed as, I don't know if it actually was, but yeah, I mean, the pieces are going to move around. If the Kings play 11, they're certainly going to move around.
Yeah.
But one thing I do think the Kings added are a lot of guys who can play multiple positions.
Mm-hmm.
Warren Fogle told me he can play both wings. I think Jeannot can play both wings. Thomas Turcotte can play center and wing. I think Laferriere can play both. So like a lot of guys.
Lewis can play center.
Lewis can play center. Like a lot of different guys who can move around the lineup, which I think is good.
Yeah. So then that brings us to question 7. Which RFA prospects will be qualified? I'm going to break this into 2 lists, guys that were either signed their qualifying offer or were signed to, like Tyler Madden was not offered a qualifying offer, but he signed a contract and he returns. So Akil Thomas, Alex Turcotte, Andre Lee, Taylor Ward, Joe Hicketts, Tyler Madden, and Samuel Fagemo all return. Portillo, Spence, Kaliev, and Byfield have been tendered qualifying offers, have not yet signed contracts. I assume that all 4 will. And then, Spence and Byfield, I expect, will be in line for sizable. Well, Byfield more than Spence will be in line for a sizable raise. I think Jordan Spence will get a raise.
Yep.
I don't know about Portillo. It'll be under 1.1 because they'll want to have him be in the minors and not.
Yeah, probably a 2-way deal.
Yeah. 825 or who knows, whatever his previous.
The Portillo one's interesting because you wonder, like, will they look at like a Peterson type extension where it was like a longer term but maybe a little higher to try to buy some years, or will they look at like a 1 year, or might he sign his qualifying offer?
Well, and if I remember correctly, Peterson signed a 3-year deal at one point. There was 2-way deal in the first 2 years and a 1-way deal in the third year.
So it kind of gave him a little bit of guarantee. It's like a Logan Thompson type deal that he just signed with Vegas.
Yeah.
Low AAV, but
with Riddick signed to a 1-year deal and Kemper signed to 3 years left on his deal, I would be surprised if Portillo signed a 3-year deal like Peterson did, where the third year was a 1-way, but not terribly surprised.
No.
I mean,
he's a little older than you kind of think. Like,
he's almost, is he 24 yet?
I think he's 23 or 24. And I think this year for Portillo is an AHL year. And then in an ideal world, this is a guy ready to push for NHL games next year if he continues to develop the way that he has.
He turns 24 on September 3rd.
So he'll be, this is his 24 year, signed as an older player, right? Played a few years in college. So maybe a little like Cal was further professionally along in his development, but goalies are slow. Like, it's a slow process for goalies. And I think they're not looking at him to play NHL games this year. And I think if he has a great year, the hope could be next year.
And the complicating factor is not the right phrase I want to use, but the change in the goalie pipeline from a year ago is massive, because now you have Slukinski and George. Mm-hmm. And as Mark Yannetti talked about, Slukinski may be 3 years away from even appearing in the AHL. Carter George may be 2 years away from appearing in the AHL. They're roughly the same age. Slukinski's a year older than George. But now you have, whereas Portillo was, okay, we have, Copley and Talbot and
older
Portillo.
veterans,
yeah. Now there's Kemper, who's 34.
Yep.
Copley and Riddick are 30, 31. Portillo's 24, and now Slakinski and George 19 and 18. So like you now have an actual distribution of ages spread throughout multiple levels. It relieves some pressure and adds some pressure theoretically way down the line, like not today, but
I mean,
a year from now,
those younger players are not going to impact Eric Portillo at all.
Not today, but maybe 3 years. Like if we're talking about what kind of contract he signs, who knows? Like if he signs a 3-year deal, maybe at the end of that 3-year deal,
I think we'll know what Eric Portillo is at that time.
Yeah.
We will not know what those other two.
Well, he'll be 27 at that time.
We'll know.
Like if he's ready to step into an NHL role,
we'll know what Portillo is. The other guys we're talking 5-6 years down the road till we kind of know what those guys are.
The next question, number 8, will there be any trades? There were 3 trades.
There will be trades.
I would argue of one big, one medium, one little. The big one, the one
it's
that
like a Goldilocks and the Three Bears situation.
The one that caught everybody off guard was Pierre-Luc Dubois for Darcy Kemper, 1-for-1. And that really kicked off the offseason. I mean, that was I still haven't quite wrapped my head around it to be fair.
Yeah.
Next up was Grundstrom for Burrows. I think that was somewhat expected.
In some way, right?
Not the specifics, but I think Grundstrom leaving and them being able to, again, the shadow of asset management rears its ugly head. This is the kind of thing that like, okay, I have no idea how good Burrows is or isn't, but you're not just losing Carl Grundstrom for nothing. You're trading him out for a player who may or may not fill a role.
Fills a role. It's just whether it's
right.
Where is it? How big is it?
Yep. And then 2 draft picks for Tanner Jeannot. That was also a surprise. And, we'll have an evaluation of Tanner Jeannot coming up soon. But this is a guy who in his career now has been traded for 7 draft picks and a player taken in the first round of the draft.
Yeah.
Like that's wild.
Yeah. And he's not old.
No.
He's he's in his 20s. He's not an old player.
No, not by any stretch of the imagination. And he, like his role in the lineup, I know this is another player. People have expectations of where he will appear in the lineup. You could tell me anything and I would believe it.
I think the plan will be Deneau and Moore with Tanner Jeannot to start the year. But like we said, I mean, look, this is anything that I'm saying is to start. This isn't going to be 82 games. It's just not.
Right.
He can play lower in the lineup. He could grind on the 4th line effectively. Scored 24 goals 2 years ago. I think the Kings would like him to play in the top 9. They didn't acquire him to play on the 4th line, but he's capable in that role if needed. And just from talking to the dude, like, I'm getting like an on-ice psychopath type guy in the best way.
Yeah.
Like a dude who is just trying to make your life miserable on the ice. I don't know. Like, I haven't really watched him play a ton to know this, but that's what he's trying to do, is to just make other guys not want to play against him.
There's definitely a theme running through the Kings acquisitions this offseason. Started with Burrows, continued through with Jeannot, and then we'll get to the UFA signings in a bit. But I'm just already bracing myself for the more Jeannot puns.
You want one?
Sure.
If you Deneau, now Jeannot.
Now Jeannot.
There you go.
So like I said, I keep a little Google sheet of the rosters. I copied and pasted it and put it on Twitter the other day, and somebody asked me why I had Laferriere on the top line. Do I expect that to be the case? And I said, I don't personally, but I'm aware that is the expectation.
I mean,
at least for day 1 of training camp.
It's what was very clearly said by the organization to me. So I'd say it's the plan right now.
But as we've seen over the last
day 1,
3 years,
day 1,
plans do not always survive. Number 9, what will the LA Kings draft haul look like? They went in with 4 picks. They came out with 4 picks and Tanner Jeannot.
Yep.
So even though they only drafted the same number of drafts picks that they went in with, I think I think the draft has to be looked at least I think the Kings have to look at it as a success. Carter George, listen, I'm huge on Carter George. Getting a goaltender with that kind of pedigree already in the second round is tremendous. Acquiring a player, hopefully, like, the closer to the Nashville Jeannot than the Tampa Jeannot for a second and a fourth is great. Woolley seems to be universally considered the steal of the draft. We'll talk to Scott Wheeler and see if he feels that way as well. And James Reeder, I confess, we still haven't spoken to him. We still haven't seen him. Haven't spoken to anybody that knows anything about him yet, but we will soon. He's on the U.S. World Summer Showcase roster. So that's something.
Small but skilled.
Yeah, and taken in the 7th round.
Yeah,
so,
at that point in the draft, right? You're finding players who have deficiencies, and if the deficiency with this guy is like he can play, but will he be big enough? I'll take a chance on that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a success too because it was a 4-in, 4-out situation, but it went in 1-4-5-7 and came out 1-2-6-7.
Mm-hmm. And Jeannot.
So even if it was just the picks, right? You picked earlier than you went in picking.
Yeah.
And by all accounts, the Kings got a player in the tier at 26 that they would have been picking in at 21, which means that by the way the Kings look at the draft, they didn't lose any value by trading down, but they got Carter George in the process.
And I am feeling really guilty because I've been so bullish about Carter George. I feel like I'm neglecting Liam Greentree. And that's really more of a function of me getting a chance to spend more face-to-face time with Carter George than I got to spend with Liam Greentree. And also goalies are goalies and whatever. But everything we've heard about Liam Greentree and seen about Liam Greentree makes him seem like a very capable young man. I expect we will see many games of him in a Kings jersey before his career is done.
Well over a point per game, and the captain
like 90-something points
of his team at 17 to me tells me that the guy can play, and excited to see how he continues, to develop this year and hopefully beyond.
And in the coming weeks, we will do what we have done in past seasons. We'll do evaluation episodes focused on Greentree, George, Woolley, and Reeder. We'll have Mark Yannetti in to talk about those 4 players. We'll have people from the teams that they played for talking about them, and we'll have Scott Wheeler talking about his impression of them. We will also have episodes evaluating all of the free agent signings and players acquired in trades. I'm recording all of those over the next week or two. They'll be released over the course of the summer. And that brings us to the final question. Will the Kings sign any unrestricted free agents from outside the organization? Now, at the beginning of the summer, I wasn't sure that the Kings would make any big splashes. So I'm going to separate Edmondson and Fogle from the second batch. I'm going to talk about those guys first. Gaudin, Malott, Studnicka, Walsh, and Jones all signed to 2-way contracts, all players with at least some NHL experience. Most of them have more AHL experience. Caleb Jones is a perfect example, and Riley Walsh for that matter too. 2 defensemen signed that could play in the NHL if called upon, could spend the entire season in the AHL. It depends on health, depends on training camp, but these are depth signings, and we'll go over the Reign and Kings roster when we're done with these 10 questions. This is sort of part of why I thought Byfield would go first. The Kings and Reign roster right now, once you sign those 4 players who have qualifying offers but not contracts, it's like July. It was July 5th, and the rosters were basically set.
Yeah.
I
not
can't,
who's on what, right?
No, but as far as these are the
Yeah.
guys. These are essentially where they're going to play. There's not going to be a ton of movement, and I can't remember if it was this early in the summer. Maybe it was a little bit earlier because the Dubois trade locked everything in with that contract. But I'm not used to everything being so sort of determined this early in the summer. And now we just sort of go like, all right, well, once these 4 guys get their contracts and we'll figure it out. Like there are moves left that could be made, but I just don't, there's nothing obvious.
The Kings could have enough room to sign those guys and probably add one more veteran who makes more than the league minimum via free agency or a trade. inclination doesn't seem to be like that's coming. They have the room to do it if they want.
Yeah.
But remains to be seen if they do, right? The interesting part, too, of the names that you listed, they're all at the same salary, I believe. Which makes roster projection even easier because even if you take a guy out and put another guy in, it doesn't change
they all
the
make
cap number,
$775,
right? Like, if you say, hey, I want the Kings to carry Caleb Jones as the 9th defenseman and only carry 12 forwards, and sorry, Samuel Fugima, you're going to the AHL, whatever, it's still the same number, So, like, it's the same cap number being swapped out at the bottom of the roster, no matter who's in and who's out, which makes it a lot easier to calculate. So even if we say, there's like a clear 20 guys who are on the roster, the other guys are fighting for spots, we know what the cap implication is, if nothing else.
Yeah. And then that brings us to the major free agent signings. Warren Foegele, which I think has been pretty universally liked as a signing. I really like Warren Foegele. Warren Foegele was one of those players, and I wish I had a more sophisticated way of saying this, but when I would watch him on Carolina, I would just go, oh man, that guy's good.
Yeah.
I don't have anything more than that, but he just struck me as the kind of player that made Carolina.
He was such a Carolina player.
Yeah. Right.
And I love 5-on-5 scoring. Like that's what I buy. I like to buy 5-on-5 scoring. That's why I like the Kevin Fiala acquisition because he did all his damage at 5-on-5. And like Warren Foegele, 4th on the Oilers in 5-on-5 points behind McDavid, Draisaitl, Hyman.
Yeah.
So like the dude produced 5-on-5 and he was only with the big guys for like half that time. I like those kind of players.
I am not anticipating that he'll have 41 points this year.
Think he'll have less or more?
I imagine less, just because I know he spent a lot of time with Draisaitl last season.
But he really didn't spend all that much time with
Draisaitl. But I mean more than none. And so I mean
I think he might have more because I don't think he'll ever have been played consistently in the minutes that he would get with the Kings.
If the line is, and we've said that we don't expect this, but if the line is more Deneau and Foegele, I would not be surprised by more. No pun intended. Mm-hmm. Because those three players, I love the way that those three players play. And I would expect that the three of them would have that cascading effect on one another. Mm-hmm. If he doesn't play there, then I'd want to, I just don't know what to expect if he winds up playing with.
I think he's good. Kevin Fiala and Quinton Byfield in a probably more minute line than he's used to playing. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an on paper thing, right? Like, we don't know how those guys will click. Yeah. We know Kevin plays a unique style that you have to play a certain way to click with. It could or it couldn't. One thing I've heard about Warren Foegele, he doesn't play like Alex Iafallo, but he has can play with anybody gene that Alex Iafallo has, like comfortable on both wings, which is nice. So if we don't like a player in a certain spot, he can probably fill any of those spots, and you can almost piece together the lineup around him and just pluck him into the last place, and he'll probably be okay there. It's
that can play with anybody element, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, that makes me anticipate success with Deneau and Moore.
Totally.
I don't know why. And
I think he would be great there.
Yeah. And then that brings us to Joel Edmondson, who I think is unquestionably an upgrade over what has been in his spot in previous seasons.
I think we've seen what people have thought about the signing,
right?
Yes,
we have.
We're not immune to to seeing it. But it is interesting to see kind of the desire to upgrade LD3.
Uh-huh.
And then when it happens, maybe it's like, oh, well, not like that. A guy who fits the mold of the signings the Kings clearly tried to make, adding certain elements to his game. The Kings will roll out two young, inexperienced defensemen on the right side, both of whom play an offensive style of game, Spence and Clark. Joel Edmondson has not a ton of interest in playing offense, but he has a lot of interest in playing defense so that a Brant Clark can play offense.
I have seen a ton of discourse about the Joel Edmondson signing. The one that I thought was actually most interesting, that didn't just resort to throwing numbers and
Right.
shrieking, was actually the Steve Dangle podcast. And they introduced the concept that I had not really spent any time thinking about, which is that there's two ways to improve your team. One is to make your team better, which is harder and more expensive. And the other is to make your opponent worse. And the only way you can do that when you're constructing your roster is to acquire players who have a negative impact on their opponents.
Right.
And so they singled out Joel Edmondson as being somebody who, over the course of a game or a series or a season, because he is physical, because he does cross-check, because he is large and punishing, if he plays the way that he succeeds when he's playing, the effect he will have on your opponent is reducing their interest in going into the corners, going to the front of the net, having energy, maybe, not going back and retrieving a puck or making a forced error because just of his presence. And that is, listen,
It's an interesting way to look at it.
the Steve Dangle guys have no skin in the game, right?
Yeah.
They don't care about the LA Kings, and anybody who watches that video can see what they think about the moves the Kings have made in general. But that was their perspective on the Edmondson signing. And I thought, like I said, that was the first one that I had seen that wasn't just how old is he, how much does he cost?
Right.
I'm going to scream and rattle my cage.
I'd have to imagine, too, that rationale would apply to Tanner Jeannot.
Yeah. Well, that's the theme
Yeah.
in all the signings, right? Like, we don't know how many, if they do go 11-7, we don't know who that seventh defenseman is.
Right.
We don't know if they're going to carry 7 defensemen or 8 defensemen. Like, who
Yeah.
knows? I suppose theoretically you could carry 9 if you wanted
If
to.
you were so inclined, you probably could.
So that is obviously the focus of the organization, right? I didn't expect it when Rob Blake made that comment about the desire to win needing to be raised, or, I think he said need to get uncomfortable with the team.
Yeah.
I didn't anticipate an influx of players who will make your opponent worse.
Yeah.
I'm just going to use that phrase, going to steal it straight from Steve Dangle. But that is clearly what they've done.
I think they've clearly upgraded in that area.
Yeah.
And from other areas, they got worse. Like other areas have taken a step back.
Yep.
Only though, because right now we have a lot of unknowns in the mix. We don't know what a Brant Clark's output will be, or a year 2 Jordan Spence's output will be, or a year 2 Alex Laferrier's, or a Turcotte or Thomas. Those guys aren't knowns in the roles they're going to play because they've never played them before. So we have to see what those guys are. If they hit the higher end of what they could be, the Kings probably haven't taken the steps back in those areas. If they don't, then they might have.
My curiosities are, last season when they brought in Pierre-Luc Dubois and the roster was set on June 28th or whatever it was, and we knew that they weren't going to have enough cap space to ice a full roster. We knew all that. It was like, holy smokes. What I said and believed, as it turns out, well, I guess not incorrectly because I had caveats, but I said at the time, if the team performs to the peak version of its construction, it would be a contender, with the caveat being that nothing ever works perfectly.
And I still think that was accurate.
Yes, as it turns out, not everything worked
Right.
to the
And
peak version of what
a number
it was.
of things didn't.
Right. And so we
Many
saw
did,
what we
and-
saw.
Yeah.
This team, I would argue that of all 4 lines, all 3 defensive pairs, and the goaltenders, I can reliably expect one element. I know what it will be, and that's Mikey Anderson and Drew Doughty.
Yeah.
I know what that'll be. It'll be one of the best defensive pairings in the league. I don't have to think about that.
Yeah.
We don't know how Brant Clark's going to perform in a full season. We don't know who he'll be paired with.
Yep.
We don't know how that pair will work. We don't know who Jordan Spence will be paired with. We don't know how that pair will work.
Yeah.
We don't know who will be paired with Kopitar and Kempe. We assume it's Laferriere. We don't know how that will work.
And even if we said, hey, we do know who is paired in those spots,
We don't know how it'll work.
we don't know how any of these lines
Right.
will work together.
We don't know if Quinton Byfield is prepared to be an effective NHL center for a full season.
Yeah.
And so there are a ton of question marks. Like I said, for me, the only one that isn't is Anderson and Doughty. So I don't even know what to expect from this season. Like I'm going into this season with almost zero expectations because there are just so many moving pieces that could wind up.
Yeah.
Like, who knows? Maybe Alex Laferriere, Adrian Kempe, and Anze Kopitar are a dynamite line.
Yeah.
Maybe Tanner Jeannot becomes that 20-something goal scorer alongside Moore and Deneau. Maybe Quinton Byfield and Kevin Fiala unlock each other's, next level because they're both fast. They both can see the ice. Quinton Byfield draws attention. It gives Fiala more space to operate. Byfield can go into the corner. I don't know. Like, who knows, right? Like,
we just don't know.
Yeah. Maybe Brant Clark earns all those bonuses.
Those bonuses. Hopefully the LA Kings can still keep the lights on.
So, you know what I mean? Like, there are just so many question marks. And looking at the rosters, as I said, we were going to go over it. Right now, as of today, on my Google sheet, I have 1 extra forward and 4 extra defensemen. That can't be.
That math is not math.
No. But meanwhile, in Ontario, there are 7 defensemen and 15 forwards, and that's not including the 4 guys that haven't signed qualifying offers. I guess I have 12 forwards, not 13 forwards.
Okay. And 8 defensemen, not 7?
Yes. Yeah.
Or sorry, yeah. You'd still have 9.
Yeah. But either way, it can't work that way. So guys will have to go to Ontario. Dvorak and Ziemer, we have to decide where they're playing.
Mm-hmm. There will be bottom of the roster battles as they are. There's always one person who isn't on your NHL block who will enter his way into it.
Yep.
Kings signed a number of guys who are on that fringe, who have played NHL games or who maybe have the potential to play NHL games. All it takes is a strong 5 games, and all of a sudden, Jeff Malott or Jack Studnicka has bullied his way onto the roster, right? Or we saw last year 1 injury in the second to last preseason game, and you have to go back to the drawing board, and the lines I'm telling you the Kings might want to use are no longer available, and you have to restructure it. So I think you're spot on. There are, even if we know certain players, we don't know how they are in the roles that they might be projected in or how their line will perform. Like last year, it was Kopitar, Kempe, Byfield. We knew it. Mm. Nice line. We knew it. The Dubois, Fiala, Kaliev experiment, we did not know. But I think we had a pretty good sense of Grunstrom, Lizotte, Lewis. Like, we knew those lines. We knew Anderson, Doughty. We knew Gavrikov, Roy. That's the bulk of your minutes that we knew exactly what we were going to get. This year, the output could be more than that. It could be less. We don't know. There's just too many variables. And that comes when you have 6, 7 younger players being put into roles they haven't played before. Upside's probably higher, but we don't know what the floor is.
And the wild thing on the forward side is pretty much what you just said. Like, I could tell you who I think the 13 forwards will be to start the season. Mm-hmm. I have no idea how they'll be aligned at the end of training camp, but I can tell you that Laferriere, Kopitar, and Kempe, Moore, Deneau, Jeannot, Fiala, Byfield, and Fogle, Akil Thomas, Alex Turcotte, Trevor Lewis, and Samuel Fagemo. I fully expect those 13 forwards to be on the roster at the end of training camp.
As it sits right now, I mean, that's got to be what we're thinking, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know if they care at this point about losing a player like Samuel Fagemo to waivers again, but they brought him back on waivers from Nashville. They signed him to the contract they signed him to this season, and he's got to go through waivers again, I would anticipate. And there isn't anybody else to take that spot, barring some sort of impressive training camp. You know, if Jack Studnicka or Jeff Malott come in and just blow everybody's eyebrows off, well, that's a conversation.
Yeah.
But as of today, July 10th, those are the 13 guys. And on defense, Anderson, Doughty, Gavrikov, Spence, Edmondson, Clark, those are the guys.
I think all 6 of those guys are in.
Yes. Right? If healthy, those are your starting
those 6 are in.
And then Englund, Burrows, Muvarari, Caleb Jones.
All played NHL games last year. Most of them played the whole year.
But that's too many guys.
In the NHL. So you got
someone's going to Ontario.
Yeah.
And then if...
Likely 2.
Yeah, well, it has to at least 2.
Yeah.
Because best case scenario with 13 forwards, you can carry 2 defensemen if you want to. Maybe they only want to carry 1. I don't know.
For conversation.
Yeah.
It's not just those 13 because Arthur Kaliev is still here.
He was sort of the elephant in the room.
And we said earlier, we expect he would sign the deal, and we don't know exactly how that situation is going to play out. But while he's here, he's here.
Yes.
And if he's here, he's going to be on the Kings.
The most complicated scenario is that Arthur Kaliev is not moved for whatever reason, is signed to a contract, whether he signs his qualifying offer or they offer him something else. They bring him to camp. They don't put him on waivers because they're reluctant to lose him for nothing, which I wouldn't blame them. And then he's not in the lineup. And at that point, he's literally just taking up a spot and cap space.
You'd have to think that in that situation, he's here with a clean slate.
Yes.
Not in that what you described.
Right.
Because if he's here...
100%. If he's here, he's got to be eligible to play. Otherwise, it's a colossal waste of time.
Two sides coming to terms on a situation that was obviously uncomfortable and didn't work last year.
Right.
But a player who has played a lot of games for the Kings over the last 3 seasons, if he's here, he's got to be given a clean slate to do what he can do. Otherwise, like you said, it doesn't work for either side. It's not helping him personally as a player. It's not helping the Kings. It has to be...
I'd argue it would be hurting the Kings.
I think
if it got
and
to that
him.
point.
It would be hurting everybody,
agreed.
right? Like,
totally agreed.
If there's a clean slate to be found, which as of right now, we can't assume anything else, it has to be that. Or something's got to give.
But that's the weird, like I said, that's the sort of odd thing with this lineup is like, it's July 10th, and I could give you, I think, a pretty accurate guess as to who the 22 or 23 players would be on the roster at the end of camp. I have no idea what the roster looks like made up of those 23 players.
I think we've just talked about 26, 27 guys. That number has to get cut to 23. There's 19, 20 guys who are undisputedly going to be on the roster. And then a couple of spots that training camp performance likely decides.
So there's still 2 months left before, training camp opens or, the rookie showcase, if it happens again, happens every year. We're in the middle of July. All that stuff kicks off the middle of September, really. I think preseason game 1 is September 23rd against Utah. So, we have
10 weeks.
Yeah. Nothing could happen. Or, you sort of alluded to it earlier, like maybe there's a trade. I don't know who it would be, but there are all those, I'm just going to pick a name at random who will not be traded. So I'm picking this name specifically to protect myself against anything. Maybe we could wake up tomorrow and Anze Kopitar has been traded for Mitch Marner. Like, obviously that would never happen, but any trade between that and Grundstrom for Burrows is possible.
Last year, I think we could pretty safely say, we're not making a trade.
Right.
Not much is going to happen. The Kings do have flexibility this year to add a free agent on top of the guys or to make a trade.
Yeah.
Not thinking they will, but they could do it.
Listen, I did not wake up the day that we found out that Pierre-Luc Dubois
you
was
and me
traded
both.
for Darcy Kemper.
You
I did not expect that to happen that day.
If that trade can happen, then
if Wayne Gretzky can get traded,
then I'm going to bring my laptop with me wherever I go throughout the summer,
Exactly.
just because you never know what might happen.
So that's sort of where we're at. It's this weird middle ground of everything's decided and nothing's decided.
Yeah.
And like I said, we'll spend the next, look at my schedule. I think we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the next 5 weeks putting out evaluation episodes about all these acquisitions. So we'll get to know the players. We'll get into what you can expect from them. I'm especially excited for the draft ones because Liam Greentree, Carter George, Jared Woolley, and James Reeder seem like, we say this every year, so I don't want to. But
4 Hall of Famers.
Yeah. But look, the Kings' track record in the lower rounds is pretty good. It's
exciting to be picking players higher in the draft again.
Yeah.
Because you know them a little bit more, you know a little more about them. There's more to say about them. It is exciting to add those players into the organization, right?
And the resume is more fun to comb over, right?
Totally.
Liam Greentree and Carter George have played in some games.
It's fun to have them at the draft and be able to chat with them and see their excitement and get excited about them and hear the organization be excited about them. It's more fun to be adding more players, at that pedigree.
So that is, I think that's our 10-question off-season update. Can't think of anything else that we need to cover. Can you?
I think those are the 10 questions, and
all right.
Nothing else crazy has happened?
No.
At least that we haven't already talked about.
It's been an insanely boring week after an insanely frantic 3-week period.
3 weeks, yep. And it'll probably, until it's not, be a boring 2 months. But
that's what the summer is.
It's boring until it's not.
But listen, Monday, July 15th, we will bring you our first player evaluation. That'll be Warren Fogle. So until then, thanks for listening, Kings fans. We'll talk to you soon.